Hello. Welcome to the first episode of Man Watch Required. I am one of your hosts, Frank, and I am joined by Scott.
Hello, everyone who's listening.
How's everybody doing? So we figured we'd kind of just walk right into it and introduce ourselves, a little bit of experience. And we kind of wanted to start talking about turnaround planning. You may hear us say TA planning or TA turnaround, so that's what that acronym kind of is. We'll try and explain it. There's always a lot in the industry. Hey, like every site you go to is different, right? So I'm Frank. I've been in the industry since about 2002. I started out as a pipe fitter. Around 2009, I got into inspection. I went the typical kind of Alberta boy route, CWB level 1. Had my journeyman pipe fitter, steam fitter, pipe fitter ticket, and then moved into my API tickets. I did do a national board exam, but I have not submitted that to get my endorsement yet from ABSA or national board itself, so it's a useless ticket right there. I don't know. Inspection is something that I really enjoy doing, and so much so that I guess I wanted to start a podcast to help educate and just tell some fun stories, because inspection is kind of weirdly underrepresented, I think, in our industry. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say so. Educate and entertain. Don't forget that.
Yeah, of course.
We're just trying to have some fun here, share some stories, pretend like we know what we're talking about.
Scott, why don't you let us know a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I actually have pretty similar experience to yourself. I started out in the trades as well, pretty well right after high school, right into fabrication for the most part. I kind of worked through that a little bit, moved into QC, a lot like yourself, went the CWB route initially. That's kind of the, unless you go to university or something, that's kind of the route you go down. So followed that path, moved on to NDE and API, and kind of do a combination of quality control and owner side inspection type of thing, mainly throughout Alberta, a little bit throughout the whole country, but mainly in Alberta.
Yeah, if you haven't figured it out, we are based in Alberta, Canada. So one thing to probably note that as the series progresses is that we have some local jurisdictional requirements from ABSA, the Alberta Boiler Safety Association.
You got it.
Yeah, I was sweating on that one.
First guess.
Yeah. So there are some outlines, and actually we do have some plans to actually kind of compare what the differences are from the code requirements to our jurisdictional requirements there, and kind of how we go about them. So this week, though, we don't want to get too in the weeds in that. You may hear some references. We are going into turnaround, like I think I mentioned before, in a couple weeks, and we kind of wanted to start with planning. Scott and I have both been furiously planning some turnarounds. Scott's been planning a turnaround coming up in a couple weeks here. And I have been planning a 2021 turnaround, which recently got deferred now to 2022. Thank you, coronavirus.
The coronavirus,
yeah.
Yes.
So it's always fun. So we might as well start, because we're both sweating bullets and we don't know what the fuck we're talking about. So let's move into the creation of inspection and repair plans. Scott, what are some things that you kind of thought about or took into account starting to plan for this turnaround? I guess maybe we should start with how the vessels are picked. Like, obviously we do work at the same, upgrader.
Same facility currently.
Same facility, facility. Yeah, so that's, we are working there. So why don't you walk us through kind of the initial stages of scope development?
Sure. And I'll give you a bit of my perspective on it. So I'm a contract guy. So what that means basically is I'll bounce around from site to site, various different clients, working turnarounds, prepping for turnarounds. So as far as how the equipment's selected, a lot of times that's kind of done by the in-house people. But basically how it works is you'll have a regulation requirement where you have to go in and inspect something. You'll have some known repairs. you'll have RBI telling you that you have to go in there. So those are kind of the things that will guide you to, which equipment you're looking at, which piping systems, that type of thing. So kind of the first thing you do, or at least when I come in for turnarounds, is putting that all together, kind of your electronic trackers, getting those things in order. And that's kind of the beginning stages of it.
Okay, so yeah, actually Scott did touch on a good point. We actually both contract inspectors. So we do travel around and we get exposed to multiple facilities, which actually isn't an uncommon thing, I guess, in the industry. Most of the other inspectors we run into are contractors. Obviously, the facilities have their own inspection staff, which do a great job of trying to compile the work beforehand and kind of give it off to us to take the lead and develop scopes. We'll go into the inspection histories, right? We'll review that kind of information, CML data or TML data, depending on how old you are and what acronyms you like to use.
Good point.
So I guess I'd hate to do this every time, but CML is a corrosion monitoring location or condition monitoring location.
Yeah, that sounds right.
TML is kind of an older reference to like a thickness monitoring location, where ultrasonics or other types of non-destructive testing are used in these locations to check the condition at that particular moment, I guess, right? And we use that data to kind of trend and determine corrosion rates. And this could go down a deep rabbit hole that I don't want to go into. But essentially, there are spots in the plant where they check on a certain frequency, which kind of give us a general condition of how that system is operating and whether or not, there may be corrosion occurring, which needs to be mitigated or taken care of by metallurgical upgrades or anything like that. So that actually does kind of flow into TA planning, because a lot of these locations which are experiencing issues are usually spots where you need the plant to come down and so you can get inside or cut stuff out, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's operating too hot, something like that. If it's like a vessel, for example, you have to go in there every once in a while. You can't just do UT for the rest of your life and look at the thickness. And that's a good point. You're looking at the condition, not just the thickness anymore. Maybe that's why they changed the name.
Possibly, yeah. I did hear one of our 5 listeners go, yes, you can do UT for the rest of your life as well.
We have 5 now?
Yeah. We lost one after the first 10 minutes here. So that's kind of like the kind of things we'll be talking about, is the creation of the inspection plans and any possible repair plans for known damage. We're going to do a quick touch on prepping for execution, maybe some QC packages with the contractors, some prefab work, or maybe some work gearing up for expected repairs. We'll talk about some in-shop stuff and maybe some receiving inspections, repair contingencies, because for those of us who kind of have been in vessels before, you find stuff, and sometimes it's a surprise, and we need to know what to do, and there's no delays in turnaround. They move forward no matter what, right?
Yeah, that's right. The end date rarely changes on a turnaround, but everything between A to B changes an awful lot. So
when you can turnarounds are specific things, and like most tradespeople, if you're people listening and they're familiar with working turnarounds, it's I don't know, I don't want to sound sappy, but it's almost like an emotional roller coaster. Like there's tensions, there's anger, sometimes sadness. So we did kind of quickly, just briefly touch on that. Scott, let's get back to scope creation. So that we have a list of vessels per se that we know we want to go into. Where would you start taking it from there?
Well, I guess what you want to do, the first thing, and this is basically never going to end until the end of the turnaround, is you want to start tracking all these things, especially in a big turnaround. I find if you don't have some sort of tracker in place, I know you're a fan of wall charts, Frank, but basically it's an electronic wall chart at this point. But yeah, you have to start tracking all that stuff. You have to get with your planning group and your mechanical contractors if they're on board at that time. Kind of get everybody's input. Communication's a important thing on turnarounds. It seems to get lost in a hurry. But yeah, the first thing I always like to do is get a grip on the scope and start tracking it and keep it tracked and keep that tracker up to date, because if you don't, you'll be lost, and you don't want to be in an update meeting and have no idea what everybody's talking about.
No, and actually, I think you identified something that we didn't actually write down on our whiteboard. We have a whiteboard with talking points because we know we'd get lost.
They don't know that.
Tracking items from turnaround, right from conception. Okay, we want to do these pieces of equipment. Obviously, budgets change. And one thing we didn't write on there was scope challenge.
Right. Who's paying for this?
Yeah. So a lot of times the inspection department comes up with a list of equipment that we want to inspect, whether it be it's its first inspection or it's due from, just regulatory timelines, or even just from service, right? Maybe these vessels can only make a certain year run because of fouling or clean, just gunk, or maybe internals have been damaged and we suspect some trays dropped or something like that. So there is a point where the list that we have, and it's not just inspection, like the electrical department, maintenance, I don't even know who else. Like, inspection is my only world. That's all I have. I got blinders on.
That's all that matters.
Yeah. So, like, you have various departments. They might have specialized teams. Like, I think at the facility we work at, there's a specialized instrumentation team. Just going after motorized valves or pneumatic valves and stuff like that, right? Because there's always issues with those, packing leaks or stuff sticking, stems breaking, which is always fun to deal with. So there's a point where the turnaround team come up and say, okay, we have our list, we need to challenge it. And how do you actually justify getting all the equipment that you want in? Or if you really want to do an inspection, like, you really kind of need to sell it, right?
Sometimes you do. And I think that depends on the facility and the turnaround team. I mean, some facilities I've been at, they'll just do everything the inspection group tells them willingly. Some, they won't do anything. They could care less what you have to say. So there's a bit of a balance there. I'm not going to name names or anything like that, but you bring up a good point with all the different subgroups. I mean, the process team is somebody you want to coordinate with too, because if they're opening a vessel for cleaning and you have an inspection due in 2 years, why would you risk a forced outage or going in there at a later date when it's going to be open for process inspection or cleaning? So that's some things you want to look at lining up. It helps the budgets, and the people that pay for it definitely appreciate that.
I didn't think we'd be trying to make sense on this. No, that's totally right. That you do want to kind of coordinate with, especially process,
as much as you can.
Yeah, because if your understanding of the actual process within the vessel and what it's doing is kind of limited, people like that are just invaluable on helping you understand exactly what's going on in the vessel, where you even need to look, what kind of, maybe certain things condense or, I don't know. I'm trying to just make words up now, but like, you know what I mean? Like there's process specific damage mechanisms that you might not be aware of.
Right.
And there may be certain additives or sometimes if you have mercaptans or cyanides in the process, like that can poison the metal, and you kind of want to know that. That might be something to look for. I've seen old inspection reports where, not necessarily at this facility, but where previous inspectors have identified certain items, but they didn't know what they were at the time, and later down the road, you do get like a blister or something, or a bigger blister or something, because they just didn't kind of recognize it, right?
Right, and it's And if you don't know and you're treating it like a new piece of equipment, you're limiting yourself to some degree. That's where your process guys are invaluable, really. They may not know a lot about the inspection world or care about it for that matter, but they sure know a lot about the process, and they can be very helpful to you in your inspection.
Okay, so scope challenges, you're going to get some pushback, and a lot of times they do want you to justify why you're going into that piece of equipment. A lot of times cleaning, scaffolding, just blinding it sometimes can be a pain in the ass, and and they really want to make sure that they're spending their money right, because it's a fixed budget that everybody is actually dipping their fingers into to get through, right? Even the electrical, the specialized teams, operations, inspection, right? There's a finite amount of money there, and the turnaround group has to balance that. Now, to be fair, we are kind of talking out of our asses on that, because as contractors,
A little bit, yeah.
we aren't really involved in those types of decisions. We get an email saying this item is no longer in the turnaround, scope is canceled.
Then you update the tracker. That's where we come in.
And then you update yeah. They haven't figured their software for that yet, but we're thankful. So we'll move past that, and maybe a future episode we can get someone who's a bit more versed in that kind of that topic and can actually explain. That would be interesting to kind of maybe get someone's opinion on that. Okay, so Scott, how, when creating these plans, we're gonna say if they don't have a RBI process in place already, or if they don't have some sort of corrosion control document or process, a document explaining the process and where some potential issues are, what do you think is the first step there? What would you do? Obviously we would look at the type of vessel. Actually, I should probably ask you if this is even where you want to take this conversation, but I would personally, if I didn't have much information, the first thing I would do is figure out exactly what the hell is going on in the vessel, right?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to. Hopefully there's a good history there. So you can at least see some past history of what has been found in there, and maybe come to some conclusions of what you might expect to find, what kind of mechanisms they found before. But I mean, sometimes you do have to go in blind. There's facilities that they just don't give you the information. Like I've been on turnarounds where you're basically in a cage with a bunch of other API 510 inspectors, and when your number's called, you get handed a piece of paper with an equipment number on it. You go find it and you inspect it and write a report, and you aren't given access to any of the past history or any of the process information. You really don't know anything. So you're expecting it like it's new, which isn't ideal, but that's just the way some places do it. So sometimes you're forced into that. But yeah, if you have access to that past history and you have the resources like the process people or even the operators, use them. And it's better than nothing. At least you have something to start with.
Yeah, I find like operators are a little skittish at first though, right? They're kind of like wild animals where you're like, you ask them a question about their plant and they're kind of like, why do you want to know that?
Oh yeah, don't start with that. You got to win them over first.
Yeah.
Gain the trust.
Little chocolates. You bring them little chocolates and kind of put them on the desk while
Box
they're writing
donuts,
the permit.
something like that. Yeah, you know, win them over first, because they do stuff that they don't want anyone to know about, especially the inspection people. So, but that's also useful information to you when you're going in inspecting. So
I would say allegedly they do stuff.
Allegedly, yes.
So yeah, like definitely operations, and the guy giving you the permit most likely works in that unit and kind of knows, you know. You'd be surprised, like even just a random conversation with an operator, and you'll walk by a vessel and he'll be like, "Oh, Jesus Christ, this thing was rattling. Something inside was rattling all about it. It stopped now." What do you mean it stopped? And does it normally rattle? He's like, "No, it's okay. That's an issue, right?" Oh, okay, yeah.
That's where you lost him.
Yeah,
too many questions.
So I would definitely, so figure out what it's doing. You can ask operations, process. maybe even a senior inspector that's around. The next step there would be to kind of identify what potential mechanisms you have. A lot of these bigger facilities do have a fairly robust system where you can look up the vessel.
Right, and that's a very ideal situation where there's lots of history available and you have access to all of that. And then there's the opposite end where you have nothing, like you're in the cage with the rest of the 5'10" guys. So there's definitely two ends to that and everything in between.
Yeah. Okay, do you want to move on, or do you want to is there anything else you want to touch on this?
Well, we're going to speak to maybe kind of the NDE selection, and that's going to be a little bit mechanism based. Maybe at first with newer equipment, you might throw everything at it when you don't really know what you're looking for, but at some point, is wet fluorescent mag on every nozzle relevant? Probably not if you're not expecting cracking or something, or if you're just looking to dig up manufactured defects every turnaround. So those are things to consider, right? I mean, you don't need to throw a bunch of NDE at it if it's not going to find anything.
Yeah.
But you want to be confident in that too.
Yeah, dead fucking nozzles. Like, no, that's a good point. So you can, after you identify what the process is, what your likely damage mechanisms are going to be, you're going to want to select your NDE. Obviously visual. You want to visually assess the condition of everything, but wet fluorescent, LPI, depending if you got an alloy, maybe even some ultrasonics and advanced NDE like PAUT, phased array, stuff like that, depending on what you're looking for, right? That'll probably be another podcast.
A lot of different segues we can go off into here.
Jeez.
We'll save it for another one, though.
Yeah.
And for somebody that knows what they're talking about.
Yeah, just sign off those reports. Oh, I thought this meant I was just receiving the report. I didn't know I was accepting the results. So we've identified our equipment for the turnaround. We know what's happening in it. We've identified the NDE, and now comes the next step. So given the damage mechanisms and the history, are we going to expect repairs? And if we do expect repairs, what kind of repairs? And I think usually the biggest kicker in this is post-weld heat treatment of vessels and materials, right?
Yeah, those are big things to consider, especially when you're talking equipment. Post-weld heat treat can be a scary thing. All of a sudden, we're talking cost and what it takes to do it. It's nothing dangerous about it. But yeah, it's a big expense, and especially for a contingency, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, those are things to consider for sure. A lot of equipment, you'll have the same repairs over and over again, so you almost know that's going to happen. And then there's always surprises too. You can't predict everything, but you try to get most of it. Minimize the surprises, but there'll be some.
Yeah, and if you're maybe not if you're, but it's good to kind of recognize patterns. So if they are doing weld buildup every time on a specific vessel, every turnaround because of corrosion, you might want to say, hey, you could put Belzona coating on the bottom of it.
Well, you would have done that anyways.
Yeah.
That's always plan A.
If you don't know, Belzona coating is a good industrial coating, and it does the job that it's intended to do most of the time. But a lot of facilities use it as patchwork, and they think it can limp them through their service life till their next turnaround. But it's a little inside joke, I guess, with inspectors. It's just, especially in our area, where it's just, if there's corrosion, put Belzona on it and it'll be mitigated, right? So yeah, if there is something like that, you could look at either adding a coating or something to something that's always pitting, say on the lower half of a vessel. Like, why keep messing about and welding on it and just putting stress in there, especially if it's not post-weld heat treated? Put an alloy cladding or a thermal spray kind of coating on there, which can resist that type of environment. And not only is it going to prolong the vessel's life, but it's just better reliable service, and you don't really have to worry. But you can go in, do a visual on the coating, maybe some coating thickness checks just to see how fast it's degrading. I don't know. I like doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, the turnaround we're planning out for that may or may not happen.
Dude, they're scaring me with that one.
But no, that's a good point. The turnaround we're currently planning for, there's I think we got 3 vessels that we're applying like I believe it's a 625 thermal spray. So yeah, to that point, there's some corrosion happening, kind of on the bottom mainly, but we're applying the thermal spray to, I believe it's about 3/4 of the way up, and most of the nozzles are accessible to the thermal spray. And then we were going to weld overlay a few, which got deferred, which going back to our previous conversation about scope challenges and whatnot. So, I mean, the stuff you're inspecting and you have in turnaround, it's not going to fail the day after turnaround if you don't inspect it. If it does, you got a bigger problem. So there's a bit of flexibility and a bit of cushion to defer things and, move them to other turnarounds, but not always. So that's just kind of example of, applying some coating, but that's something you probably have to push for maybe a couple turnaround cycles, because obviously that's not cheap, but it will save you a lot of inspection time in the long run. So you got to sales pitch it a little bit.
No, and actually that kind of does loop back to our scope collection, where if you do have a handle on the vessel's history and you may have potential repairs, you got to hammer that into the scope, because they have deadlines for scope submission, right? And after, they're pretty hard on those deadlines, like I said, because there's one money pot and there's a lot of fingers just dipping in there to kind of grab as much as they can, because obviously everybody's kind of purview, or like everybody has a blinders on in their plant, especially at larger facilities where electrical matters, inspection only matters, maintenance only matters, process only matters, right? We're
this turnaround only matters.
Yeah. So you want to let them know ahead of schedule, definitely, that like, look, coating this vessel or half this vessel it's got to be like $200,000 just for that. Right. And they're going to shit themselves. And at least having that in the plan as a contingency, where they can kind of earmark a couple $100,000 for that, or even a smaller portion, say, to coat a lesser portion of the vessel, I guess, for lack of a better word, where, it is also about compromise, where you could say, you know what, we're seeing corrosion. Maybe if it's a column on the bottom 2 courses in the bottom head, let's just coat that.
Yeah. So do you need to coat the whole thing? No, probably not.
No.
There'd be, in some cases, zero benefit to that. But yeah, to your point of the deadlines, it's pretty easy to get scope out after the deadline. Not always as easy to get it in. That's just where the money guys come in, and that's their job. So, you want to get things in that are going to be problems or are going to prevent problems. You want to get those in, and you don't want to know about a repair and not have it in the plan as a contingency and then find it kind of expectedly. You don't want to be that guy either. So if there's like almost certain repairs, you want to have them in part of the plan and in the budget.
Yeah, no, definitely. So that being said, so I guess we can kind of roll this along a little bit and say, we've identified the majority of our repairs, or we know what we're kind of expecting to expect.
We know what we think we know.
Yeah. We're going to move over to kind of turning these inspection packages now over to our contractors to, create ITPs, even if it's just for blinding and opening the manways, or full blown, frickin' nozzle replacements, or whatever you need to do. Like, you need to get these ITPs out. Well, maybe not the ITPs out. You need to get the instructions out, like the scope of work out, so they can start creating work packages and IDPs for execution. And I guess if you don't know what an ITP is, it's an inspection test plan, which
we got that one on first try too.
I have it written on my hand. Essentially, it is a list of the workflow. So it outlines how the job is going to be completed, and it also outlines any hold points. So the contractor's QC is going to identify where they're going to be doing their quality checks. It'll show what they're doing for their quality checks. And it's almost like a checklist. And then they'll have a few columns. And then there'll be a column for the owner's inspector for verification. And the owner inspector will have the right to add a hold point, a review point, or just any kind of check-in point where they feel like is critical in the job step. And then obviously in Alberta, ABSA may have some hold points on there as well if they need to get involved, which this is Scott's specialty. So I can let him kind of start going off. ITP, Scott, let your knowledge shine down on all of us.
That's a good point with the ABSA, actually. We won't get too much into that, but yeah, that is something that we deal with here that, a lot of the rest of the world doesn't. I'm assuming a lot of people all over the world listen to us. But yeah, if we're doing something that's out of the scope of the owner's manual, what they're approved to do, then we have to get our regulators involved, and they say it's okay. And sometimes they come out and supervise it to some degree and then certify it. But yeah, I liked how you explained the ITP as a checklist. That's essentially exactly what it is. And that's basically how it works. We give them our repair plans, what we think is the best way to attack this. And a lot of times, and don't forget this either, the QC people and the mechanical contractors, they have very good input as well. Sometimes more knowledge on how to repair a piece of equipment or specific damage than the owner's inspectors do, because they've probably seen it a lot more, because they're in the business of traveling around to turnarounds, a lot of them. So take that info as well. I mean, there may be things that their quality manuals require them to do that the owner's site doesn't. So they may add some additional things that are just requirements for that company. And then you can put as many hold points on there as you want or as little as you want. The new construction guys listening are probably used to having a hold point on every single line and being there watching every step of the way. And then the turnaround guys are more familiar with, looking at the hydro test and the finished product type of thing and a bunch of document review. So, there's two different worlds there. But that's how that works. And they'll start getting that to you because ideally all of those are approved and back and issued to their foreman and those people, well before the execution date, so they can walk it down, see what they're into. And then they got a planning stage as well too. So
you said actually a couple good things in there. Walk it down actually kind of excited me.
Does anybody know what that means?
Yeah. So that is actually a big thing that I'm a big fan of. You're right. Having these packages and actually going to visit them in the field, at least that specific job, and having these packages ready not only allows the contractor to get out there and start executing it when they can, but it does also allow the inspector to know kind of what steps are happening, and that ultimately does lead back to the ITP, where they know, okay, we both agreed, like there's usually the very first line item on an ITP is essentially acceptance of scope of work. So the facility will say, for lack of a better word, the facilities inspectors will outline what the job is. The contractor will create a work package for that specific job, and that is acknowledged as one of the first line items, saying that we both agree that we are going to cut out this valve or whatever the job is, or replace this portion of the line or whatever. Let your imagination soar. We're both going to agree that this is going to happen, and then from there they're going to list their steps. I kind of, maybe Scott gave me a weird look there. What are you thinking?
No, it just reminded me of something. One of my mentors, I guess you could call him, in the industry, he explained it to me, somewhat early on in my career, that basically the ITP, and more so for the repair contractor, but for both, for the owner and the repair contractor, the ITP is essentially a signed contract or a signed agreement between the repair organization and the owner, and you've both agreed that that's what you're going to do. And as long as you follow that, there's going to be little to no repercussion to either side, because that's what you agreed to do.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what it is a signed agreement.
Yeah, we're doing this. Yeah, and I'm going to watch you do that. Right. So, no, that's a good one. And then, walking down the jobs, be familiar where these job locations are. And I think that might be something we can talk about in TA execution.
Yeah, I got another good one on this, actually. You just reminded me again.
Yeah.
I'll jump in here. Yeah, on the walking it down, that's, you're going to walk down your inspection scopes and be familiar with your equipment and everything, of course. But once your repair contractors are in there, they're going to start walking down their jobs. And, they might point out some things that you missed here and there, more probably for planning. But I'll just give you an example for this. One of the turnarounds we're coming up that we're planning for. We're going to replace an exchanger in kind, so a shell and tube exchanger. Actually, we're using the channel head, I believe, for some odd reason. But anyways, essentially just replacing the whole equipment. So it was a piggyback style. It was the bottom exchanger, and it was completely encaged with piping with no brake flanges anywhere. So nobody really thought of this because, for inspection side of things, we're just worried about the manufacturer and making sure they're ASME approved shop and this and that, and getting the vessel built and getting the turnover and that. Nobody really looks at how it gets installed.
Yeah.
Or I should say very few people do. But then when you have your repair contractor come in, they start walking on. These are the things they look at because, okay, how are we going to rig this out of here? How are we going to get a crane?
Yeah.
So they come back with a proposal of, 20 some flanges have to be cut into this thing. Needless to say, that was removed from the scope. Or I shouldn't say removed, deferred. So that's another kind of going back to that topic again, where, you do have that bit of cushion. So we crunch some numbers and, we can get another 5-year run out of this shell. So the compromise was to replace the bundle, leave the shell, next turn around, replace the shell, and very likely the bundle again. So that's just kind of a story I thought I'd throw in there relating to walking it down, where that was for about 3 days, it was a very significant increase in scope. And then it was quickly after that, a very large decrease in scope. But a very big swing both directions.
And I would probably say, we'll just do closure welds on all 20 of those flanges, right?
Well, obviously.
So
not anymore. The owner has to do them now, so not anymore.
Yeah, that could be another good episode when
We'll talk about that one for about an hour another time.
Yeah, in preparation for this, you can imagine how many topics kind of came to mind and how to narrow it down. But like I said in the beginning, like we do want to do a kind of like an APSA regulation episode, and a new thing was closure welds, and it's causing some difficulties.
New change, we should say, I guess.
Yeah.
They've been around a long time, and for anybody in the U.S. listening to this, you can follow ASME relatively easily, but I don't know what a good word to use is. We have a regulator here that says otherwise and puts another document in place that supersedes that. So closure weld is essentially a weld you don't hydro test. So for all intensive purposes, the new construction, you tie in your piping system into an existing one. There's no way to isolate it. So you hydro test everything up to do your last weld, and you might do a service test, some extra ND, stuff like that. Our regulator slaps a few other requirements on that. So we'll just leave it at that for now. But essentially there was a nice loophole in there that was kind of gray enough that we could work with. They've closed that recently.
Actually, there may be a third kind of host for this podcast. Our friend Matt, or my friend Matt, awkwardly enough, Scott still has to meet him, but I think they'll get along famously. He actually, at the facility that he works at, and actually Matt's going to bring a great perspective because Matt is actually an employee inspector, and they recently had some issues at his facility, and he rung me up and asked me about doing closure welds on OLEDs.
He called you up?
Scary enough.
Oh,
yeah.
I don't know if I like this guy anymore.
That's why I want to introduce him to you, so he can call you instead of me. So, Yeah, and essentially that's exactly what I told him was there's kind of some newish regulations regarding closure welds. And
What was this recent?
like last week.
Oh,
yeah.
since the change. Okay.
Yeah. And even OLED welding is definitely can get sound deposited metal, but due to the curvature and sometimes the sizes, it's a difficult weld to do. And
Yeah, rarely gets done properly.
And NDE on OLED welds usually produces a pain in the ass, right?
So, good way to put it.
They had a large, maybe that might be something he'd be comfortable talking about.
Sure, yeah.
If we're lucky, he might grace us with his presence tonight. We'll see what happens, but that would be a good topic to talk about. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we could go on all night about that.
Okay, so we're kind of getting off the rails here. We talked about getting. We last left off here, I guess, at kind of prepping. So getting ITP set up.
We should check mark things as we go.
Oh, fuck. Is your arm that long?
Where's the tracker?
We need a stick. Yeah, we need a wall chart for the fucking podcast. Yeah. Okay, so let's say there is some prefab stuff that needs to happen for turnaround. We've got our packages. We know our scope. There's some piping coming off a vessel. If you're kind of familiar with, say, inspection, a lot of overheads, right? You kind of get, if it's not properly controlled coming off the overhead, we get some condensation, we get some dew points reached, which may cause corrosion on overhead lines, right?
Yeah, great example. A lot of people going to 317 these days.
Yeah. The material just sounds cool, like 317.
I think that's part of the selling feature.
Yeah.
What is that?
It's corrosion resistant and sounds fucking sweet, right?
And not that expensive.
Yeah, I guess, yeah. So say we do have corrosion in an overhead line and a section of piping needs to be refabricated. So that'll be identified in our inspection scope. We'll send that out to the contractor. A lot of times it's going to be a lot easier to fabricate that in a shop under controlled conditions where you can get a lot better quality, I guess.
Yeah, probably better quality. In most instances, faster and probably cheaper too. But that's not really something we dictate too much, but it is something we got to keep our thumb on a little bit. So that's kind of where it'll go to like the planning team. They'll kind of decide. If everything was prefabbed on site on a dirt floor, you might not get it all done before turnaround. There's that. And it's probably a lot more expensive too. And the quality, right? I mean, you might have a nice facility on site and you can produce sound welds and nice piping, things like that. But it's probably going to be better out of a shop. And that's something to not forget about either, because you don't want to have a whole onslaught of piping come in that nobody's looked at and you're not satisfied with it. And you have all these turnovers to review. And you're in the middle of turnaround now, and the field contractor can't certify any of their documentation because the shop documentation hasn't been certified. And a big peeve of mine, specifically for newer people in the industry, is just signing data reports without ever looking at. We'll use piping as an example because there's always piping to build. Just certifying something and never looking at it. In my opinion, I like to put holds on hydro tests, one, to make sure they did it, but I'm not too overly worried about that. But that's your opportunity to look at what they built for you.
Yeah.
Go there, have a look at it. It's not going to leak. If it does, they'll fix it. That's not the concern. That's your opportunity. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be your concern. If a reputable piping shop that you use a lot, they're not going to fab something and it's going to leak. That's fairly unlikely. But that is your opportunity to have a look at it. And if, they're doing things that you don't like, that's the time to correct it. And then you can feel good about signing that data report. We use AB83s here, but, no different than an ASME form or something like that. Would you sign that without looking at it? I wouldn't.
I didn't know we were supposed to read them. I just thought it was people looking for my autograph.
Now you know.
Yeah. Well, you know what? That's actually a good point too, is even while you're at the shop, is check in on the QC and see how the package is coming along. Is there stuff like, you know, a lot of people don't know, but I guess if you're in the industry, you will know is, you know, do they have all their weld maps completed and stuff? Do the welders have the proper certifications, material certifications and stuff like that? Those are big ones. Right? You're right there. You get to see their facility. Go talk to them. You know, unfortunately, not everyone wants to be talked to by the owner's inspector, but you know, a lot of people are pretty receptive and they do want to talk to you. And generally, if you ask them about their work, they're willing to talk to you about it, right? And obviously you don't want to walk in there with your chest out and I'm the owner's inspector, bullshit, right? Go in there, be happy, unless you got to play the bad guy. Like I actually, in my fab shop experience, I remember that one of the welders was welding it was like 36-inch, like heavy wall. Like they were welding this thing, rolling it for like 2 days.
Sure,
like it was probably a couple inches thick, and fucking welder didn't look at his welding rod, and he was using 7018, and it was an alloy material, we'll say, and it got caught. And that thick a material and cutting all that out was fucking crazy, right?
Yeah, I don't imagine they counted for that in their bid.
Yeah, right. So, you know, that's a good time as the owner inspector to check on that stuff and catch that stuff, because, you know, one of the inspectors at the facility we're working at, actually, if I can get him on, which he may want to do, he could tell you stories all day of mismatched material, wrong welding rods and stuff like that. Like, obviously he's probably got double our experience. Like, we're pretty close to 20 years. I think we're creeping on like maybe 18 and a half, right?
Sure. Yeah,
right, maybe, you know,
somewhere in there.
Yeah. So
I don't like to count. Long ways to go.
No, which that's freaky in itself.
It
right?
is.
Jesus. What have I done in 20 years with myself? Nothing. Talking into a microphone in an empty room with Scott.
Finally made it.
Yeah. So we're going in, we're checking our prefab stuff, making sure everything's good. Like Scott said, it's your opportunity to check on the quality. You want to look at the welds, you want to look at maybe even dimensions, bust out a square and a tape.
Sure, right? Audit some things, and don't think that your QC people are totally incompetent either. That's not the point we're trying to get across. You know, most of the time that stuff will be picked up by them, and that's a good thing. You want them to pick that up. I mean, in a perfect world, you shouldn't even have to look at it. But, you know, the odd thing creeps by. I'll circle back to your point about the material mismatch. Just throw in a little interesting story too. And this doesn't happen a lot. Again, the QC people, the materials receiving people, they typically catch this stuff. But I was reviewing a turnover from a shop, and let me think here. So it was all 5 chrome material. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I got that right. So it was all 5 chrome. It's piping. Had a couple valves. So I want to say there was about 4 spools, valve each, 2 valves each, something like that. 2 of the spools, I was just flipping through some PMI reports. Why are these valves 9 chrome? That's interesting. I'm sure they have, approval from a materials engineer or something. It was probably a, deliverables issue. The supplier had 2 5 chrome, 2 9 chrome. If you want the other 5 chrome, they're going to be a year, something like that.
Yeah.
So I wasn't too worried about it. So I asked the QC manager, oh yeah, showed me something. Okay, yeah, looks fine. I'll just spot audit the MTRs, make sure that, it's is what you say it is. Then you can redline the drawings. Have a look at the MTR. F91. That's interesting. I thought 9 chrome was F9. So that may not seem like a big difference, and it really isn't. You have that, 0.25, 0.3% vanadium, whatever it is, very minimal. But you go from, P5B to P15E, right?
I'm just going to nod in agreement. I don't have the book in front of me, but yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah, essentially you're switching P numbers, so all of a sudden you have WPS that's not qualified.
Yeah.
Now it's a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So that's just some, you don't find stuff like that a lot, or if you do, maybe you should look for a different fab shop. But, things like that happen, right? And that's kind of why you want to, that's at the review stage, but you would have probably not caught that in fabrication unless you're looking really close. But yeah, you want to be there, you want to look at stuff, and you definitely want to do a good review, especially if they're new and you don't know what they're like yet.
Yeah, and doing that quick review can actually save that piece, that spool or that piece of equipment from getting shipped all the way to site, partially installed until, somebody kind of fucking figures it out. And then, they're like, Frank, you went to the shop to inspect that. You signed off. There's your signature, right? I was like, oh, it's my autograph he wanted me to get, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of stuff could actually save you. And that's a really good point too, Scott. Is definitely if you're there and they have that NDE stuff, check it out. Check the PMI reports, especially if you got alloys or exotics.
Yeah, when you're starting to get those different flavors of metallurgies, have a look at them, because it's very tough to keep that stuff straight. And QC guys are very busy running around in a busy shop. They do a good job, but I mean, you just got to look at that stuff. It's easy for just something small to slip through the cracks.
Yeah.
And, that example went through materials receiving, went through a quality control guy. A pipe fitter probably looked at it, whether he knows what any of that means or not. And I think it even probably went through the project engineer or whoever it was when they were talking about the substitutions. So, I mean,
yeah,
it's a small thing. And would anything have came of it? Probably not. But, there's registration requirements that weren't met there properly. So that just has to be addressed.
Yeah, and that might be something else we'll get into on our ABSA episode, is the regulatory documentation and registration that follows piping and equipment in Alberta. It is a little bit similar across a few provinces, I would say, though, Alberta leads the way just because Alberta produces oil, or we try to.
Yeah, I think it's just the volume of fabrication, manufacturing, repair. That's probably what it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the other provinces, speaking for Canada, all the other provinces are, they're slowly kind of following suit. Saskatchewan's very, very similar to what we do in Alberta now. And BC used to follow the national board rules. And from what I understand, they still kind of do. But they do have a regulator, and they're, I believe, starting to kind of... follow some of the things we do here now, owner-user programs, things like that.
Yeah. Okay, Scott, what should we talk about next?
Where are we at here?
Well, we're at prefab and expected repairs. And we've pretty much talked about going into the fab shops and checking on that. We've talked about the QC packages. In shop, I guess the next step would be maybe a receiving inspection on site. Like, you do definitely want to check piping or the vessel or whatever you got coming. As soon as it comes to site, you want to check it, because actually Matt actually had some experience with this. They shipped him a new bundle, but it fell off the truck in transit, and they picked it back up and put it on the truck and trailer. Nice. And then delivered it to site.
Well, what else can you do?
So it was like lovely. Yeah. I didn't know we had the baffle, the exchanger baffles bent at that angle.
Well, they're going to get bent when you push it anyway, so they're just getting that out of the way. That's a good story, actually. We're working through something it's not similar at all. It's similar in the fact that it's a bundle. That's about it. But, long story short, there was a mix-up in the, procurement, purchasing process, whatever happened there. And they didn't do a code hydro test on the new bundle. And I believe the manufacturer was assuming it was going to another manufacturer to build the shell and put it all together, and they would certify it. Mm-hmm, so they sent it out as a part. That's fine. You can do that. They didn't do the code hydro test. So now we have to figure this out on site in a shop in Edmonton, somewhere in Alberta, before this goes into turnaround. So, those are things that if they show up early enough and you catch that, not the biggest problem. It's a little bit of cost for somebody, but you can get that done and then, execute your work, swap your bundle or whatever you're going to do. If that's something you find out after, because typically replacing bundles, our regulator doesn't overlook us for that, but they'll find out. We have documentation we submit to them. So that's not something you want to find out after the fact when it's too late. So those receiving inspections are very important, that stuff can happen with piping too. But yeah, that's just an example.
Yeah, checking the dimensions of a bundle or piping as well, right? But like the hydro test, so what are you guys going to have to do with that? They don't want to just do it in the shell? Like,
well,
is it a lot of extra work just to do it right there?
There's a couple things with that. One, you can't see the bundle, which if you're doing a leak test for gas integrity, doesn't really matter. When you're doing your new code hydro, and now our regulator has to certify this thing because it's not certified yet. So that's one thing to consider. The other one is if there is something leaking, we're not going to know where without pulling the bundle out.
Mm-hmm.
And what if it does leak? It's just something to get out of the way. So we just have get a test ring fabricated and test it on site, or send it to one of the shops that can do it. That would be the ideal situation. But yeah, there's a couple ways you can go about that.
Yeah, and if you don't know what an exchanger looks like or a bundle looks like, I would say Google tubed heat exchanger.
Shell and tube exchanger should give you some nice pictures.
Yeah, it's essentially a series of tubes, which could be straight or commonly they're bent in a U, and there's like a top and the bottom, and liquid will feed into, say, the top and flow through the tube into the bottom side into something called a channel, which channels the flow out into piping to where it needs to go.
That's what that means.
Yeah. So definitely check that out. Maybe once we get a bit more advanced, or if we decide to do video, we can have, on-screen photos or something, or some sort of overlay.
It's kind of like when you're cooking spaghetti and you take the handful of spaghetti out of the box. the box would be your shell, and the handful of spaghetti is your bundle.
Yeah.
It more or less looks like that.
Yeah. So, Scott, we also have repair contingency, but I think we kind of covered that already with kind of repair plans and knowing kind of what to expect, or potentially what to expect, right?
Yeah, it seems like we talked about that already.
And the only other thing I guess we have is reporting, but, I kind of think that could be talked about on the kind of execution side, or maybe even we could probably do another episode on turnaround execution, and then a follow-up one on that, on creating the next inspection cycle and taking the information. We might be able to wrap them into one, but just in case.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about there, even just the pre-turnaround execution, because we're talking essentially pre like there's a phase where you get a week, you get a month or two out, and it's a whole different animal. There's all of a sudden all this kind of fabrication going on site. Some places have pretty strict decon procedures, things like that. So there's a lot of things we could go to just in that pre, and then leading into the pulling feed.
Yeah.
Without even getting into the meat of the turnaround.
Yeah, and if you haven't figured out, decon is decontamination. So they'll
Another thing I learned today.
Yeah, flush the unit out, or specific equipment, so it becomes a little safer for entry. But that's something we can get into later.
Yeah, and that's one of those things. You have a wide variety too. I mean, some places it can only be welded pipe, and it has to be hydro tested, and it goes right from the first flange to the DO, and there's rarely anything hits the ground. And in other places, they just dump the equipment right on the ground. So, and everything in between, obviously, too. Threaded piping, hose, variety of different things. But yeah, there's definitely two different perspectives there too.
Yeah. DO is another acronym for like, I don't know. It's like a dirty drain, essentially, like a crap that gets blown down, or, it feeds into like some sort of, lack of a better word, a sewer system where it's recovered and reprocessed.
Those are like reverse acronyms, aren't they? Oil drain or something like that. They like to flip those ones around just to mess with you.
For utilities, they usually do, right? Like, like for their N2 headers or nitrogen headers and stuff, it's like gas inert. Like, Yeah.
It's like the French version or something.
Yeah, it might be just because of the company that we work at or the facility, but sometimes.
Oh, I don't know. I see that in a lot of places. I'm not sure what it is. Somebody smarter than us could probably give us an answer.
It's engineers just overcomplicating things as usual, right? So on that note, I think we've kind of touched on just kind of the absolute basics of planning. You can hit us up on Instagram at manwatch_required. Let us know what you think of the episode. Leave some comments. Maybe we touched on something or we didn't touch on something that you kind of think would be an interesting podcast. Let us know. Just put it in the comments. Message us. I'm thinking we should have the audio on YouTube as well. So you can listen to that and comment as well. And we'll probably get some email addresses out there so you guys can contact us if need be. Don't expect a reply, though. We have real jobs.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, I don't know. We're going to have fun with this. Like I said, I hope it's educational. I hope you have fun listening and take something away from it because there's not a lot of stuff for inspection out there, right?
No, there's a lot of dry stuff too. I mean, we want to make this fun, and we're not experts by any means, but we've been around the block a few times, and we've seen some things that we think are entertaining to talk about. But yeah, definitely give us ideas. We've got a lot of them, and we got a lot of time to fill. But yeah, if there's something that you want to hear us talk about, yeah, definitely let us know.
Yeah, and we're excited as we inch closer to turnaround to kind of document how that goes, because a lot of people, especially maybe our spouses, which I doubt will listen to this, they only see us working long hours and coming home smelling like hydrocarbon, right? With like soot and oil embedded in your skin and hair. So it might give them a little bit more of a perspective as to what's endured and kind of what everybody deals with. It'd be unfair to say that what inspection deals with, they don't want to let us weld on that. Oh, and too much time, right? So there's always arguments on repairs and stuff, and I'm sure we'll get into that. Hopefully with not too much detail to kind of give away what's happening, but enough detail to provide context and information in case you ever find yourself in that situation. What do you think?
Yeah, and if nothing else, another avenue to criticize us. So yeah. There you go.
Yeah, it's always fun, right? So I hope you guys had fun listening. Probably wasted an hour of your life, but
think anybody's still listening?
I'd be amazed.
Me too.
I'd be amazed. Well, I guess if we get a comment, that might indicate they listened far enough, or they're just so enraged that they comment right off the bat saying,
"Yeah, I'm thinking the latter, but we'll take it."
Yeah. All right. So thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you guys soon.